Hi, in this video, I will discuss the health effects of sodium. Now, many people are aware of the link between sodium intake and blood pressure, and the actual scientific evidence for such a link is strong. A recent so-called Cochrane meta-analysis by researchers from Queen Mary University of London concluded that a modest reduction in salt intake for 4 or more weeks causes a significant and, from a population viewpoint, important fall in blood pressure. This reduction in blood pressure by salt restriction is observed in people with and without high blood pressure. And they also concluded that the current recommendations to reduce salt intake from 9 to 12 grams per day to 5 to 6 grams per day will have a major effect on blood pressure, but are not ideal. A further reduction to 3 grams per day will have a greater effect and should become the long-term target for population salt intake. Now, many of you already know that high blood pressure is an important risk factor for cardiovascular disease risk. Now, taking into account the link between salt intake and blood pressure, what is then the possible impact of a targeted reduction in sodium intake on cardiovascular disease? Well, according to several recent modeling studies, reductions in salt intake would result in large reductions in cardiovascular disease and considerable cost savings to healthcare systems. One particular modeling study concluded that sodium consumption above 2 grams per day is responsible for 1.65 million deaths from cardiovascular disease in 2010. Also, it was projected that a salt intake reduction of 3 grams per day in the US population alone would decrease the annual number of new cases of coronary heart disease by 60,000 to 120,000. And it would decrease the annual number of deaths from any cause by 44 to 92,000. In short, there is a strong incentive to reduce sodium intake, which is based on the logic that reduced sodium intake lowers blood pressure, and a lower blood pressure translates into a lower risk for cardiovascular disease and other diseases, such as kidney disease. However, some people take issue with that line of reasoning. They want to see concrete and solid evidence demonstrating a clear benefit of sodium reduction towards cardiovascular mortality in the population. Basically, they want to see evidence that lowering salt intake results in fewer people dying from heart disease. But unfortunately, it is very difficult to do proper scientific studies to get an answer to this question. And there are only a small number of useful studies, and they don't allow us to reach firm conclusions. Now, the absence of unmistakable proof for a cardiovascular benefit of sodium reduction has led certain interest groups and individuals to strongly question the value of salt reduction and have led to calls that salt reduction programs should be abandoned. Also, Gary Taubes, a hyped-up journalist mostly known for his fierce stance against sugar, has joined the ranks of salt proponents. In my view, many of these people have unwittingly fallen prey to the propaganda of the salt industry, which is in complete denial about any ill effects of excess salt consumption and writes on their website that the body of evidence in favor of salt is strong too. Studies from the Journal of the American Medical Association show that people with the highest sodium intake have the longest lives. In fact, reducing salt to levels recommended by the US government can cause harm and decrease life expectancy. Okay, really? Groups such as the American Heart Association have strongly resisted these messages and continue to insist on the importance of sodium restriction in the overall strategy towards reducing cardiovascular diseases. They argue that calls for abandoning the AHA dietary guidelines for sodium consumption are based on flawed analyses of data from observational studies that were not planned to study sodium relationships, with great potential to yield misleading results, and on misinterpretation of clinical trial results. Now, although there's little controversy within the scientific realm on the need for sodium restriction, there is uncertainty about the target value for daily sodium intake. In other words, how low should you go? For instance, a recent panel from the US Institute of Medicine concluded that there is insufficient evidence to justify a target sodium intake of 1.5 grams per day, whereas the American Heart Association remains committed to this value. and this issue will continue to generate plenty of discussion in the next few years. The bottom line: at the current level of intake in nearly all countries in the world, reducing sodium intake in the population is expected to substantially reduce the number of deaths from cardiovascular disease and other diseases, and thus provides clear justification for the salt reduction programs initiated in numerous countries.